Somewhere in your memory, there is a sound you cannot name, but have never forgotten. The freight train at 2 in the morning. The rhythm of the wheels on the track. The way it faded into distance, leaving only silence and the certainty that something vast was moving through the night. That rhythm was not random. Jointed rail was laid in 39-foot sections. At 40 miles per hour, each joint produced a click exactly 0.67 seconds apart. You were hearing the heartbeat of American logistics. Every click was a ton-mile of freight moving through the darkness while you slept. That sound carried the weight of a civilization, and the system that produced it achieved something that modern observers consider impossible. Scheduled freight, trains arriving within minutes of their appointed times, across a continent, without a single computer, without satellite tracking, without cellular communication, with nothing but paper, telegraph wire, and the most precisely synchronized human network ever assembled. The instrument that made this possible now sits in museum cases and antique shops. It weighs approximately 4 ounces. It is made of brass, nickel, and ruby jewels. It was carried in the vest pocket of every engineer and conductor in America, and for 4 minutes of failure, it killed 9 men. On April 19, 1891, a fast mail train and an accommodation train collided head-on near Kipton, Ohio, 40 miles west of Cleveland. Both engineers died with their hands on the throttle. 6 postal clerks were crushed when the mail cars telescoped. The bodies were, by contemporary accounts, horribly mutilated. Arms and legs torn off, flesh so badly scalded it fell from the bone. The engineer of the fast mail was found with his hands still on the throttle, dead, his hands and face blackened beyond recognition. The investigation traced the disaster to a pocket watch. The engineer of the accommodation train had been given written orders to pull onto a siding and let the fast mail train pass. He believed he had 7 minutes to reach the meeting point. He had only 3. His watch had stopped for 4 minutes, then restarted without his knowledge. 4 minutes of mechanical silence became 9 coffins and a funeral for the old way of running railroads. The Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway summoned a Cleveland jeweler named Webster Clay Ball. He was not a railroad man. He was a watchmaker who had built a reputation for precision. Ball was among the first jewelers to synchronize his clocks with time signals from the Washington Observatory. He understood that time was not merely a convenience. Time was infrastructure. The railroad asked him to investigate timekeeping across their entire network. What he found appalled him. Conductors on freight trains were using cheap alarm clocks hung on nails in their cabooses. Engineers carried whatever timepiece they could afford. Some watches ran fast, some ran slow, some stopped without warning. There was no standard. There was no inspection. There was, in a system where 2 trains sharing the same track depended entirely on knowing the precise time, no precision at all. Ball spent 4 months studying the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern's timekeeping systems. He examined watches. He interviewed crews. He documented the chaos that passed for coordination. And then he transformed American railroading. Within 2 years, Ball had established what became known as the General Railroad Timepiece Standards of 1893. These were not suggestions. These were commandments written in the blood of the Kipton dead. Every watch used in railroad service was required to meet specifications that remain remarkable, even by modern standards. Open-face design only, so the crystal could not be accidentally cracked by a hunting case lid. Winding stem positioned at 12 o'clock, not 3, so the watch could be read at a glance without repositioning in the hand. A minimum of 17 jewels in the movement. those tiny ruby bearings that reduced friction and extended accuracy across decades of daily use. Adjustment to at least 5 positions, because a watch that keeps perfect time lying flat may lose seconds when carried upright in a pocket, or tilted crown up, or crown left, or crown right. Temperature compensation from 34 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, because a railroader in Minnesota winter and a railroader in Arizona summer needed identical precision. Steel escape wheel, double roller, micrometric regulator, bold black Arabic numerals on a white dial with heavy black hands, readable at a glance in darkness or bright sun, and accuracy to within 30 seconds per week. Not per day, per week. That is less than 5 seconds of drift in 24 hours. Your smartphone, with all its satellite synchronization and atomic clock references, does not keep significantly better time than what Ball demanded of mechanical watches in 1893. Close enough did not exist in railroad timekeeping. Running approximately on time was the same as running late. A train that arrived 1 minute after its scheduled time had failed to make its schedule. The culture of precision permeated everything. Railroad time was a concept that meant something beyond punctuality. It meant the integration of all human activity into a synchronized whole. It meant that when you said a train would arrive at 4:17, you meant 4:17, not 4:20 or 4:15. The railroad watch was not merely a tool for telling time. It was a sacrament of precision, a physical manifestation of the commitment to exactitude that made the entire system function. The specifications were not arbitrary. Each requirement existed because its absence had contributed to accidents. The lever-set mechanism prevented accidental time changes. The minimum joule count ensured long-term accuracy. The position adjustments prevented the unpredictable variations that had killed men. Every specification was purchased with blood. You may have heard the expression on the ball. This is where it originated. A railroader whose watch passed inspection was on the ball. A railroader whose watch failed was not merely embarrassed. He was unemployed. The watch was not a tool. It was a license to work. It was proof that you understood what precision meant in a world where imprecision meant collision. These watches cost money, serious money. A Hamilton 992, one of the most respected railroad grades, might cost $60 in 1910, when the average weekly wage was $15. 4 weeks' pay for a watch. The railroader paid for this himself. He paid for his own repairs. He paid for his bi-weekly inspections, when an authorized jeweler would examine the movement, test the accuracy in multiple positions, and certify that the watch still met standard. If his watch failed inspection, the authorized jeweler provided a certified loaner while repairs were made, but the bill came to the railroader. This was not a company benefit. This was the cost of admission to a profession that demanded perfection, because imperfection meant collision, fire, and widows. By 1908, over 2,000 Ball-authorized inspectors examined more than 1 million watches for 180 railroads. Webb Ball's time service controlled the inspection of watches on half the railroad mileage in America. The Swiss watch industry, which had once dismissed American manufacturing as crude imitation, began adopting Ball's specifications. Today's officially certified chronometer standards are still based in part upon what a Cleveland jeweler demanded after 9 men died because someone's mainspring hesitated for 4 minutes. But the watch was only one instrument. It told you what time it was. It could not tell you what to do with that information. For that, the railroads developed something even more remarkable, a system of coordination that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, synchronized thousands of trains on hundreds of railroads, and operated with a reliability that modern supply chains cannot match. They called it timetable and train order operation. Understanding how it worked requires understanding a fundamental problem that no longer exists. In 1880, every town in America kept a different time. Local noon, was when the sun reached its highest point overhead, which varied by 4 minutes for every degree of longitude. There were over 50 different times in use by various railroads. A train leaving New York for Chicago crossed through so many local time standards that its schedule was a navigational chart as much as a timetable. Confusion was guaranteed. Accidents were inevitable. In 1883, the railroad simply decided to fix this. They established standard time, dividing the continent into 4 zones, 35 years before Congress got around to making it law in 1918. The railroads did not wait for permission. They did not request legislation. They did not form a committee to study the problem for a decade. They looked at a problem that made their operations dangerous, and they solved it by mutual agreement among competitors. This was the first hint of something the Soviets would never understand. Competition and cooperation are not opposites. They can coexist when the participants are intelligent enough to recognize mutual benefit. American railroads competed for traffic while cooperating on standards. They fought for customers while agreeing on time zones. They were rivals who shared a language. The timetable was the Bible of railroad operation. Every employee was required to carry one. Every employee was required to memorize it. Violation of any rule could bring punishment from dressing down to suspension without pay to termination. It contained not merely schedules, but the entire architecture of precedence. Which trains were superior by class? Which trains must yield? Where passing sidings existed and their exact lengths? What speed restrictions applied and where? Special instructions for individual locations. The timetable told you who you were in the hierarchy of traffic and exactly where you must be at every moment of your run. A train listed in the timetable was a regular train. It had the right to its track at its scheduled time. An inferior train, one with lower priority, was required to clear the main track and wait in a siding a safe time before the superior train was scheduled to pass. The safe time varied by railroad, but 5 minutes was common. If your train was inferior and the superior train was due in 7 minutes, you had 2 minutes to get into the siding and clear the main track. Miss that window and you were occupying space that belonged to someone else, someone moving at speed, someone who would not be able to stop in time. The superiority system was elegant in its logic. Trains could be superior by right, by class, or by direction. Passenger trains outranked freight trains. Scheduled trains outranked extras. In case of equal class, the timetable specified which direction was superior on that particular line. The dispatcher could override any of this with a train order, but the default was clear. Everyone knew who had the right of way. Everyone knew who must yield. Ambiguity was eliminated by design, but the timetable could not anticipate everything. Mechanical failures happened. Weather intervened. Traffic fluctuated from day to day. A system of pure timetables would have been frozen in time, incapable of responding to reality. Enter the train order. The train order was a temporary amendment to the timetable, issued by the train dispatcher and conveyed through a human network of telegraph operators stationed along the line. When conditions required deviation from the schedule, the dispatcher dictated an order over the telegraph wire. The receiving operator copied it onto manifold paper, the thin onion skin that produced multiple carbons simultaneously. The operator repeated the order back word for word. Only when the dispatcher confirmed accuracy did he release the order with his initials and the complete time. Then came the physical delivery. The train order signal at each station, a semaphore that could be seen from the locomotive, told approaching trains whether orders awaited them. If the signal was set to stop, the train halted and a crew member walked to the operator's office to receive the orders. If the train merely needed to receive orders without stopping, the operator attached the papers to a Y-shaped train order hoop or a long staff and held it up as the train passed. The fireman or engineer snagged it at speed, plucking their instructions from the air while their locomotive never slowed. 30 tons of steel moving at 40 miles per hour, and a man reaches out his arm and catches a piece of paper that tells him where to go next. This was not a system with computers handling the complexity. This was a network of human beings, each with a tiny piece of the puzzle, coordinating in real time through electrical signals and paper carried at the speed of an express locomotive. The dispatcher was the mind of the system, but he saw nothing directly. He sat in an office, perhaps hundreds of miles from the trains he controlled, with a telegraph key, a telephone, and a train sheet, a large ruled form on which he recorded every movement reported to him. When a train passed a station, the operator sent an OS report, meaning on sheet, giving the train number and precise time. The dispatcher entered this on his sheet and could then visualize where every train was on his territory. The train sheet was his map. The OS reports were his eyes. His judgment was everything. An experienced dispatcher knew more than locations. He knew tendencies. He knew that Engineer Thompson always ran a little ahead of schedule, pushing his locomotive to make up time. He knew that Engineer Wilson was cautious on the mountain grades, consistently running 2 minutes late through the Summit Division. He knew which conductors could be trusted to make tight meets, and which ones needed extra margin. He knew the capacity of every siding, the condition of every grade crossing, the quirks of every signal system on his territory. This knowledge could not be programmed. It was absorbed through years of listening to the telegraph, tracking movements, learning the human element that no rule book could capture. You remember the sound of a classification yard at night, the crash of couplers engaging, the squeal of retarders, the rumble of cars rolling down the hump. That was thousands of tons of freight being sorted by gravity and human judgment. The hump yard was the American innovation that made high-volume sorting possible. A locomotive pushed a cut of cars up an artificial hill. The hump then uncoupled them, one by one or in small groups. Gravity took over. The cars rolled down the hump through a complex of switches into the correct classification track for their destination. Tower operators controlled the switches, routing each car to its proper track. Retarders, mechanical brakes built into the track, controlled the speed. A car loaded with steel plate rolled faster than a car loaded with mattresses because steel is denser and momentum depends on mass. The tower operator judged the weight by watching the speed and applied the retarders accordingly. Too much braking and the car stopped short. Too little, and it crashed into the cars already standing on the classification track. The Enola yard in Pennsylvania covered 316 acres. It contained 145 miles of track. It operated 476 switches. On a busy day, several thousand cars were sorted there. Each car arrived as part of one train and departed as part of another, its journey through the yard lasting hours, or sometimes a single night. The yardmaster held the pattern in his head. He knew which tracks were filling up. He knew which outbound trains were building. He knew which cars needed special handling and which could be humped without concern. A computer could have done the calculations. A computer could not have absorbed the judgment that came from decades of watching cars roll. You have been told that such coordination is impossible without computers. The record says otherwise. In 1952, American scheduled freight achieved 94% on-time performance, without GPS, without satellite communication, without a single silicon chip, with pocket watches, telegraph keys, train sheets, classification yards, and the accumulated expertise of tens of thousands of men who had learned their craft the hard way by doing it wrong until they learned to do it right. The Soviets watched this with fascination and misunderstanding. Their propagandists declared Soviet railways superior. Their engineers studied American methods. Their planners believed that central control could achieve by command what Americans achieved by something far more subtle. Let us examine what they actually accomplished. In 1950, the Soviet Union operated approximately 106,000 kilometers of rail line. The United States operated over 350,000 kilometers, more than 3 times the track. But the Soviets concentrated traffic on their main lines with such intensity that their track density, measured in ton-kilometers per kilometer of line, was 6 to 7 times higher than American levels. This sounds like efficiency. It was the opposite. High traffic density on limited track means congestion, trains waiting for track space, shipments delayed not by distance but by the inability of the infrastructure to handle the volume forced upon it. The Soviets had built a system optimized for a number on a report rather than for moving actual goods to actual people who needed them. The Soviets moved their freight cars an average of 227 kilometers per day. American cars averaged only 95. Soviet propagandists trumpeted this as proof of superior operations. They were measuring the wrong thing. American cars moved more slowly because they spent more time actually being loaded and unloaded, performing the function for which they existed. A car racing empty across the steppe counted the same in Soviet statistics as a car carrying grain to market. The statistic rewarded movement. The economy needed service. Empty car miles reveal the truth more clearly. American railroads ran approximately 41% empty car miles, meaning cars traveling without cargo to reach their next loading point. Soviet railroads claimed only 29%, but Soviet cars carried less per loaded mile because Soviet manufacturing could not achieve the precision required for full utilization. When a boxcar's door mechanism does not align properly because the factory that made it was filling a quota rather than meeting a specification, loading takes longer and may damage the cargo. When brake components do not match specification, speeds must be reduced for safety. When couplers vary by millimeters because quality control means nothing, when quota achievement means everything, switching becomes hazardous and time-consuming. The American advantage was invisible because it was architectural. It did not appear in statistics about train speed or track utilization. It appeared in something the Soviets could never copy because they could never understand it. The Interchange Agreement. In 1950, America had over 140 railroads. They competed viciously for traffic. They advertised against each other. They undercut prices. They fought in legislatures and courts, and yet a boxcar loaded in Boston could travel to Los Angeles across 6 or 7 different railroads, switching from one company's track to another's, without a single piece of cargo being reloaded, without a single waybill being rewritten, without anyone on either end understanding or caring about the corporate complexity in between. How did mortal enemies achieve such seamless cooperation? The Association of American Railroads, formed in 1934 from earlier cooperative bodies, administered a system called per diem. Every day, a railroad held a foreign car, a car belonging to another company. It paid that company a daily rental fee. This created a powerful incentive. Empty cars cost money every day they sat. Full cars on the wrong railroad cost money until they were sent home. The fastest way to stop losing money was to load the car and send it home. Per diem transformed 140 competitors into a single integrated network without a single government mandate. The profit motive did what central planning could not imagine. Self-interest aligned with system efficiency. Soviet cars were Soviet cars. They did not cross borders easily. They did not interchange without bureaucratic process and mountains of paperwork. When they needed repair, the spare parts came from whatever factory had filled its quota most recently, which might mean parts that did not quite fit, produced by workers who received no penalty for imprecision because the quota measured quantity, never quality. American car service rules ensured that any rail car, anywhere in the network, could be maintained with standardized components that were truly interchangeable. The Janney coupler, patented in 1873, and adopted as the standard in the 1880s, remained dimensionally identical for over a century. The Type E coupler contour, standardized in 1932, has not changed since. A car built in 1940 could couple with a car built in 2024 without modification. That is not tradition. That is engineering discipline maintained across generations who understood that standards are not constraints on innovation, but foundations for reliability. The Soviets manufactured to quota. Americans manufactured to specification. The difference was everything. Ton miles per railroad worker tells the final truth. This measures how much freight each employee actually moves. In the American system of the 1950s, a single railroad worker moved approximately 300,000 ton miles per year. Soviet statistics, adjusted for their different accounting methods, reveal a workforce moving far less per person. Their system required more people to achieve less result because their system could not trust its components to work correctly the first time. Volume is not velocity. Capacity is not capability. They had track. We had a system. They had orders from Moscow. We had a dispatcher who knew his territory, knew his crews, knew every siding and every grade and every engineer's particular habits. We had conductors who carried the entire operation in their heads. We had engineers who knew their locomotives the way horsemen knew their horses. We had a culture of accountability where delays were traced to specific named individuals, not departments or committees. This was consequence proximity. That means the person responsible for an error was known by name to the people affected by that error. Not by algorithm, not by incident report filed in triplicate. By name, spoken aloud in the yard office, remembered at the next bidding for runs. When a car was delayed, the responsible yard was identified. When a meet was missed, the responsible dispatcher was identified. There were no anonymous failures. There was no hiding behind process. Every error had a face attached to it. This concentrated minds wonderfully. The conductor, who had worked the same division for 20 years, knew which shipper's dock had a tight clearance that required careful spotting. He knew which industry track had a weak switch that needed extra attention. He knew the yardmaster's preferences, the dock foreman's schedule, the peculiarities of each customer on his run. He carried this in his head because no manual could contain it, and no computer could replicate the judgment that came with experience. The engineer knew his locomotive the way a cavalry officer knew his horse. He knew that the third cylinder ran a little hot. He knew that the brakes pulled slightly left on wet rail. He knew every grade, every curve, every bridge on his division. He knew where the track rose imperceptibly in a way that demanded more throttle and where it fell in a way that required braking before the grade became visible. This knowledge could not be transferred in training. It was earned through years of observation, accumulated in nerve and muscle memory, tested in every kind of weather and every emergency. How long did it take to become an engineer? Years. You started as a fireman, shoveling coal, learning the locomotive from the other side of the cab. You watched the engineer work. You learned when he opened the throttle and when he closed it. You learned the sounds the locomotive made when it was running well and the sounds it made when something was wrong. You learned the grades before you ever touched the throttle yourself. The seniority system ensured that the most experienced men held the most critical positions. This was not bureaucratic impediment. This was quality control through accumulated knowledge. The apprenticeship system transmitted expertise that textbooks could not contain. An experienced conductor showed a new man how to read the waybills, yes, but also how to read the shippers. Which customers needed their cars spotted precisely, and which would accept approximate placement. Which dock foreman could be trusted, and which needed watching. Which industry tracks had hidden hazards. This was institutional memory carried in human minds, transmitted through daily work, renewed with each generation of railroaders. You remember things being built to last. They were. The 40-ton AAR standard boxcar was constructed of heavy steel plate over a riveted frame, with 3 inches of oak flooring that could support forklifts and resist decades of loading and unloading. It weighed approximately 21 tons empty. It was rated for 40 years of continuous service. Some served for 60. The Janney coupler weighed 85 pounds of forged steel, rated for 350,000 pounds of tensile force. When you heard cars coupling in the yard, that heavy metallic crash followed by the settling of slack, you were hearing 85 pounds of forged steel engaging with 85 pounds of its identical twin. The sound meant connection. The sound meant the train was 1 piece longer. The sound meant freight was about to move. Modern shipping containers are rated for 15 to 20 years. The chassis that carry them are lighter, made of aluminum and composite materials. Because weight is money and durability is someone else's problem. We have traded permanence for efficiency. We have traded 40-year cars for 15-year containers. We have traded the craftsman's pride for the accountant's calculation. 1956, the Federal Aid Highway Act. 41,000 miles of interstate highways, funded by the federal government, maintained by state governments, free to use for any truck that could meet the weight limits. The pitch was freedom, flexibility, the open road, military necessity in case of nuclear war. The hidden reality was subsidy on a scale that transformed the competitive landscape permanently. The railroads built their own track. They maintained their own track. They paid property taxes on their own track, taxes that funded schools and fire departments and all the services of government. They received no federal funding for infrastructure. The trucking industry rolled on highways that taxpayers built, taxpayers maintained, and taxpayers repaired after the trucks wore them out. Fuel taxes covered a fraction of the true cost, and the fraction varied with every change in the price of oil and the politics of taxation. The competition was never equal. It was designed to be unequal. In 1940, rail carried 62% of all intercity freight, ton miles. Trucks carried less than 10%. By the early 1950s, trucks had reached 17%. The interstate system accelerated the transfer. By 1975, rail had fallen to 37%. What looked like market choice was actually market distortion. What looked like progress was actually abandonment. The Interstate Commerce Commission, created to prevent railroad monopoly, had become the instrument of railroad strangulation. Railroads could not set their own rates without approval that might take years. They could not abandon unprofitable lines without hearings that gave every affected shipper a chance to object, even if the line lost money on every train. They could not merge without regulatory review that consumed decades, while their competitors consolidated freely. As one Boston and Maine official said, every rate case had become a carnival of oratory. They were regulated as monopolies, while their competitors multiplied freely. Return on investment tells the story in cold numbers. The railroad industry averaged 4.1% in the 1940s, 3.7% in the 1950s, 2.8% in the 1960s. By the 1970s, the average fell to 2%, and by the end of that decade, railroads operating 21% of American tracks were bankrupt. Penn Central, once the largest railroad in the nation, collapsed in 1970 in what was then the biggest bankruptcy in American history. The expertise bled away. Why would a young man apprentice for years to become a railroad engineer when he could drive a truck after a few weeks of training and make comparable money? Why would a company invest in developing dispatchers who knew every siding on the division when the division itself might be abandoned next year? The generation that had built and operated the greatest logistics network in human history retired, and no one replaced them. The knowledge was not transferred. It simply vanished, one retirement at a time, one funeral at a time, until the men who remembered how it worked were museum pieces themselves. Here is the irony that should burn in American memory. China now operates the largest high-speed rail network on Earth. Between 2008 and 2019, China built an average of 5,464 kilometers of railway per year. From 2013 to 2021, China invested $679 billion in belt and road infrastructure, more than half of it in rail and related projects. The China Railway Express connects 62 Chinese cities with 51 European cities across 15 countries. Nearly 50,000 freight trains have run on the route since its opening. Russia completed the electrification of the Trans-Siberian Railway in 2002 and continues to invest in rail freight capacity. Europe, despite abandoning freight rail more thoroughly than America, has begun reinvesting in rail logistics as highway congestion worsens and fuel prices rise. They studied us. They learned from the system we built. Then we forgot our own lessons while they applied them. We won the Cold War. Then we adopted the philosophy of surrender, the belief that the market would sort everything out, that expertise was less valuable than flexibility, that systems built over generations could be replaced by algorithms running on servers. In some data center, no one would ever visit. We traded the dispatcher who knew his territory for the tracking app that tells you your package is in a truck somewhere. We traded scheduled freight for delivery windows. We traded the clock for the calendar. You were not imagining it. The precision was real. The reliability was real. The superiority was real. What you remember is not nostalgia. It is accuracy. Somewhere in an antique shop or a collector's drawer, there is a pocket watch with a white porcelain face and bold black Arabic numerals. The winding stem is at 12 o'clock. The movement contains 17 jewels, perhaps 19 or 21. The back plate is engraved with a railroad name, a grade designation, a serial number that links it to inspection records long since crumbled to dust. Pick it up. Feel the weight of it. The 4 ounces of brass and nickel and mechanism that once synchronized a continent. Wind it gently. Hold it to your ear and listen to the tick. 5 beats per second, the tempo of precision that Webb Ball demanded after 9 men died at Kipton, Ohio. It still keeps time. Within 30 seconds a week, most likely. The technology has not degraded. The standards have not softened. The precision that one Cleveland jeweler imposed on an entire industry still ticks away in watches that are now antiques, keeping time for no one, measuring seconds that no longer matter to anyone but collectors and historians. The watch did not fail. The system did not fail. We failed the system. We took something that worked better than anything the Soviets could build, that worked better than anything any nation had ever built, and we dismantled it because someone convinced us that roads were freedom and regulation was the enemy, and the market would provide. The market provided trucks on congested highways, delivery windows instead of scheduled arrivals, tracking apps that tell you nothing you can act upon. The market provided efficiency that is measurable and excellence that is lost. Listen. In the distance, if you are old enough and live near enough to a surviving rail line, you may still hear it. The freight train in the night, the rhythm of the wheels, the click of jointed rail, though most main lines now use continuous welded rail that hums rather than clicks. That sound is the ghost of what we were, the last echo of a system built on precision, maintained by expertise, synchronized by pocket watches and telegraph keys, and the accumulated knowledge of generations who understood that moving freight across a continent required more than vehicles and track. It required trust. It required standards. It required men who took pride in being on the ball. You remember it because it was real, because you lived it. Because you were there when America moved freight with clockwork accuracy, on time, every time, without a computer in sight. The evidence remains in museum cases and antique shops. in the hands of collectors who wind their railroad watches every morning and know they will not lose 30 seconds before next week. The memory is vindicated by the record. What was built was better than what replaced it. And somewhere in the quiet of the night, if you listen carefully, the proof still rolls on.